Thank you. Good morning, all. Welcome to day 3 of SCCS 2021. We start today with the 5th plenary offered by Dr. Radhika Govindarajan. And to introduce her, we have Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan, environmental historian, political historian, and Vice Chancellor of Kriya University. Mahesh?
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here today, both because this is a forum very dear to me, and also because unusually this is a very distinguished speaker I have known from, I think, her master's days. We first met at a conference on ancient India, New Insights, a very important conference for people like us, because it was one where all the presenters were people who were doing MPhils and PhDs. It then came out as a book. And one of the things I have always marveled about Radhika's work, Dr. Govindarajan's work, if she'll permit me to call her Radhika, is that it takes something which seems familiar and makes us think about it in new ways. So she did her bachelor's in history at St. Stephen's College in the University of Delhi. She went on to do a master's at the Center for Historical Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, after which she trained to be an anthropologist. She worked at Yale University. And her thesis won a very important award. I won't bore you with the long list of names of many awards that she's been given. Her book, Animal Intimacies, has also won awards. And I think it stands out for 3 very interesting reasons. One, because it's so well written. Everyone who's read the book said that they enjoyed it. I can assure you this is not true of most books by anthropologists and historians, barring one member of present company, namely the speaker. The second is that it takes us to a world which we ought to know exists, a world where there are bears and leopards and monkeys and goats and domestic kind and people. And she shows that the human and the animal are being reconstituted every day in the lives of these people and animals. And in many ways, there aren't barriers between them. It's a continuum. And what are the ways in which the continuum shapes and reshapes and coalesces is what she explores. Which takes me to the third very important point. It's that I have more than once, I think, heard her speak on a very important paper she wrote on a very sensitive subject. And it was on goat sacrifice in very important temples in the Uttarakhand, Himalaya. And people often asked her that, are you for this or against it? And she had to make 2 contradictory statements. And I want to share what she said. She said, as an observer, it's not her job to judge. It is to listen, understand, and know why some people practice this sacrifice while others don't. What are the different ways in which people do or do not justify it? What are the different ways in which people do or do not oppose it? But more importantly, she said she has to make a distinction between her personal choices about how she deals with animals, which I'm not going to tell you, and what other people. So I think we welcome Dr. Govindarajan, particularly to a conference on conservation, a student conference on conservation, a very distinguished one, which has now been on for many years, because she straddles not just the divide between the social and the natural sciences, between the animal and the human, between anthropology and history, between the social sciences and literature, because originally many of the social sciences originated as branches of literature. She also straddles something which I'm sure people in conservation wrestle with every day, which is the relationship between knowledge, the mind, and emotion, the heart, because conservation is whatever one says about both. How does one strike a balance? How do we strive for it? So without further ado, Dr. Radhika. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rangarajan, Mahesh. It's such an honor to have you introduce me. As Mahesh said, I first met him as a very anxious master's student who was writing an MA thesis on the history of colonial conservation. So it really feels like coming full circle to be able to talk to you, to be introduced by Mahesh. And I really appreciate that insight and just that generosity with regard to my work. I also want to say a huge thank you to Samira, to Madhuri, Sara, and Siddharth for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. I wish we were face to face. I'm looking at my own picture on the screen, which is not my favorite thing to do, but I hope that we have a chance to engage each other somewhat. So I'm going to share my screen just to, I don't have too many slides, but I just wanted to share some names with you as I go through. But the title of my talk today is Paltu-Jungli, the Fluidity of Wildness in Contemporary Uttarakhand. Hopefully it's showing on your screen now. And the question that really motivated this talk and some of the work that went into it, which is part of my book, Animal Intimacies, was what might ethnography offer conservation? And ethnography, as some of you might know, is a practice that is usually associated with the discipline of anthropology. It's both a method and a kind of theory that is predicated on a long-term immersion in social worlds and to understand how it is that people, and in this case, perhaps non-human animals also, how they understand and construct social worlds. And it's usually based on a very, as I said, long-term kind of immersive experience in these social worlds, but also through an engagement with individuals. And I'm particularly interested, I think, in that question of how treating non-humans, and in my case, non-human animals, as ethnographic subjects might illuminate about the history, politics, and ethics of conservation. What might multi-species ethnography help us understand about conservation? And I use the term multi-species ethnography, which was coined by the ethnographers Eben Kirksey and Stefan Helmreich, to speak to how it is that we might think of animals as having legibly biographical and political lives. That is, as individuals who actually have histories and trajectories and tendencies of their own, much like human subjects, that we have to follow up and trace in ways that bear remarkable similarity to the ways in which we work with human actors. And I'm happy to talk about that a little more. I'm not really going to dwell on that, but I'm happy to talk about some of the challenges involved in trying to think about animals as individuals who have biographical and political lives later. But in doing so, I'm also thinking with a whole slew of ethnographers in particular, but also people from other disciplines who've tried to think about how narrative and stories are not unique to humans alone, but how storytelling is actually something that non-humans engage in. And I'm thinking particularly about the work of two ethnographers, Tom Van Doren and Deborah Bird Rose, who argued that non-human animals dwell in something called storied worlds. That is, places about which they produce meaningful narratives through their own actions. So the idea that you can actually try and understand what stories animals tell about their lives and the world they inhabit through certain kinds of methods. In their case specifically, they think about these penguins who come back over and over again to this particular location in Australia and how that reveals certain ideas of home. Again, something I'm happy to talk about later. I just want to set the scene for how I'm thinking through this question of ethnography and multi-species ethnography in particular. Now, you might say that thinking about animals as individuals who have these very rich kind of historical and political lives as beings who tell stories might open up the problem of anthropocentrism, right? Or the idea that you can understand animals only through this human lens, that you run the risk of transposing human emotions, human capabilities onto animals. And to that, I often counter with Frans de Waal's term, which is anthropodenial. And he suggests that anthropodenial might be a greater sin than anthropocentrism, so that it might be a greater sin to deny animals the capacity to engage in emotion, to engage in storytelling, than it is to imagine that they do these things. So he argues that the great sin is human hubris in imagining that humans are exceptional in being able to tell stories and being able to experience emotion, in being able to narrate historical experience, and says maybe we should be more creative. Perhaps we can imagine a certain kind of playfulness with how we engage with animals. And I actually think that's very critical for conservationists, because very often one of the challenges within conservation is this idea that there is this kind of unbridgeable divide between humans and animals, that there is this world of unbridgeable difference. And what I'm arguing for in my talk today, and which you'll see through my ethnography, is a critical anthropomorphism, one that recognizes the risks of imagining that animals or non-human animals share something with humans, but one that is also open to the possibilities that are thrown up by imagining that there are moments of connection across difference. So I'm going to try and explain some of this through a story that I heard very early on when I was doing my field work in Uttarakhand about 10 years ago. But it's a story that has really stayed with me and has helped me think about what wildness and what wildlife conservation in India mean. I did my field work in the state of Uttarakhand in Kumaon. And this was the region where I had been interested in understanding the legacies of wildlife conservation going back to the colonial period. But when I was there in 2010, I heard about the story of the runaway sow during an unexpectedly kind of unfortunate event. It was 2010, and I was helping Komal Arya carry bales of dried hay that were up to the shed where we would spread it in front of our cows and goats who had been bellowing their hunger for the last hour. As I made my way carefully down the steep concrete path that connected homes at the bottom of the village to the main road, we ran into Nima Bisht, our elderly neighbor. You could read the agitation that gripped her wiry frame. Shiva, she explained, her voice full of dismay and excitement. When we asked her what was wrong, she startled at the fact that we had not heard the news until then. You don't know that Hema Arya from Sirmaur was attacked by a wild boar this morning? She asked us. She stretched her hands to show us the size of the wild boar's tusks. She couldn't even run before it attacked her, she said to us. A visceral shudder passed through my body at the thought of the attack, and I asked if she was badly hurt. Nima's tone was somber as she shared what she knew. The 108, the 108, which is the emergency number that people use for dialing an ambulance, came to get her. She might even be dead, who knows, she said. Someone told me that the boar tore her open with his tusks. He was walking, she told us, to the village tea shop on the edge of the road to find out more. Her daughter, she told us, was Hema's friend from school, and she needed to know. So Komal, who was my friend and whose house I was living in at the time, said, well, why don't you go with her and find out and you can come back and tell me. By the time Nima and I reached the shop, it was crowded with people who had just arrived from the afternoon bus. The air was thick with news of the attack. Their only daughter-in-law, who's going to work in the fields now that she's in the hospital, tusks the size of an elephant. I heard she was still alive when the ambulance came. God knows how. The elderly owner of the shop, Jeevan Bhatt, cleared his throat meaningfully several times as he poured yet another cup of chai from a saucepan. Listen, he said. Slowly, the babble of voices in the cramped shop ceased, and people started listening to him. One thing is clear. These wild boar, these jungli sungar, are getting more dangerous every day. There was a time when we neither saw them or heard them, not even in the forest. Now they roam the village by day. It's our food that they eat, our bodies that they tear. It's a bad situation, and we can't touch a hair on these bastards' heads, or else the forest wallahs will show up, and then 2 or 3 of my fields are near the forest. I've stopped visiting them, Radha, one of our neighbors, said. A few hours earlier, she had told Komal and me that her husband was looking for a buyer for those fields that were near the forest, preferably the same family from Kolkata that had just bought a plot of land in her village. The last time I went there, 3 or 4 pigs were lying in the grass nearby. I ran back home and I haven't been back to those fields since. Why put my life in danger for some half-eaten potatoes? Jeevan Bhatt, the shopkeeper, chimed in and said, why do you think I started this shop? Who has the money just to feed pigs? Potato seeds, potatoes, cauliflowers, cabbage, peas, madua, which is finger millet. They eat everything. I can't believe there was a time when there hardly used to be any wild pigs here. This was the second time that he had mentioned that wild boar were new additions to the landscape, and I was curious and asked where those wild boars had come from. About 30 or 40 years have passed, he said to me, or maybe a little more. How many years, Mahesh? He asked, turning to the wizened old man sitting next to him and rolling his beedi. I don't remember exactly when, Mahesh said, but it's been some years. I remember it was the end of winter. Yes, Jeevan said. Back then, the IVRI used to experiment on animals, giving injections to cows and pigs, doing research on animal diseases. Did you know that? The question was directed at me and it caught me by surprise. I was puzzled by the sudden mention of the IVRI, the Indian Veterinary Research Institute, that had been established by the British colonial state in the nearby town of Mukteshwar in the earlier 20th century. I wondered whether he had misunderstood my question on why these wild boar had come from. I did know that, I said to him with some uncertainty, wondering how to turn the conversation back to boar. Yes, they only stopped when the government shifted the lab to Bareilly. But in those days, they used to keep a lot of animals. It so happened that a pregnant sow ran away from the cattle kraal because the caretaker had a habit of leaving the door open. I know because my father was a peon there. They were all sent to look for her. Where did she run to? I asked, intrigued by the direction the story was taking. The forest, Mahesh said, who had been nodding as Jeevan talked. His own father had worked at the IVRI. The kraal was near the jungle, and she ran straight there. Maybe she wanted to have her children in an isolated place. They sent many people into the forest to look for her. Many villagers looked for her too, but she was never found. No, she never was, another farmer who was sitting there affirmed. My father told us that when he came home from work, all the officials were laughing because they couldn't find a pig between them. The villagers were also laughing that the officials couldn't find this pig despite all their power. She taught them a good lesson. Laughter rang out at his mocking tone. At the time, he had told me that a leopard would finish the job and eat her. My face as I listened to these stories must have betrayed my doubt because Jeevan took one look at it and a defensive tone crept into his voice. It's not a lie, he assured me. The pig ran into the jungle and was never found. A few years after that, we began to see a lot of wild boar in the jungle. Nobody thought she would survive. It was a big jungle full of tigers and leopards, but she must have given birth to her children, and they gave birth to more children. Maybe some wild boar came from elsewhere and they had children together. Pigs have lots of children. Now, who knows what was in those injections the people at the IVRI gave her? Maybe she had more children than normal. And I can tell you one thing, these pigs here have very large tusks. Anyway, all we know is that we had no such problem with wild boar before that. Yes, Mahesh said, the trouble started then because that pig went wild. वो सूंगर जंगली हो गई, he said. And now the state tells us that we cannot kill these pigs because they are wild animals. Now you tell us, are we mad or are they? The story of the pig who went wild was something that I heard very often during the course of my fieldwork, particularly in villages that dotted the perimeter of the dense forest that was controlled by the IVRI. In some accounts, she did not escape to a life of freedom in the jungle, but was forced by circumstances to live it. It was said that the person in charge of caring for the pigs would usually let them graze on their own by the edge of the forest. They would always return just in time for their evening rations. But one time, the pregnant pig did not come back with the rest. Perhaps she had given birth to piglets in the forest and she couldn't leave them. But she was never found after that day. The entanglement of people's lives with pigs in that region, with wild boar, was thus viewed as an outcome of this distinctive history of an individual animal who had linked people, animals, and institutions in unexpected ways. I found the pig story really compelling because it offered a glimpse into how wildness and the wild, as modes of perception, as states of being, as forms of power and contestation, were produced in contingent and asymmetric circumstances. Protected by the state and supposedly cyborged by science, think back to the reference to how their tusks were larger than those of other animals, because who knows what was in those injections that she was getting. But protected by the state and cyborged by science, the wildness of this pig's body and those of her progeny illuminated for many villagers the workings of power and hierarchy. For them, her story exposed the uneven and arbitrary nature of wildness, the colonial logics of which remain in force in post-colonial conservation laws in India. The Indian Wildlife Protection Act prohibits the hunting of any wild animals except in special circumstances where, quote, an animal has become dangerous to human life or property, including standing crops in any land, end quote. This, as I'll discuss later, is in keeping with colonial exemptions to prohibitions on hunting in cases of damage to crops by wild animals. However, in practice, the post-colonial state, much like its colonial predecessor, rarely issues cultivators a license permitting them to kill wild animals who attack crops or who destroy crops and attack people, especially in places where agriculture is only for subsistence. To add insult to injury to this history, there was the fact that the wildness of the pigs itself was suspect. these pigs were domesticated at some point, Mahesh said. Okay, we can't kill leopards, I understand that. But pigs? It was this disbelief and the protection of the wild boar that led Mahesh to declaim that if a state protected animals on the grounds that it was quote unquote wild, when its wildness was so clearly historically contingent and unstable, that either the state had lost its mind or the citizens were losing theirs if they still believed in the possibility of seeking justice from the state. For them, the pig was a classic creature of empire, a post-colonial animal whose wilding was made possible by the biopolitical writ of the state that bestowed life on wild boar while dooming its human citizens to death. But I hope to show in my talk today that this was not the extent of people's relationships with boar, that they believed that this was simply, that wildness was simply a creation of colonial power. Instead, I hope to show that the pig story illuminated what I call an otherwild, which is a wildness that is not pure, right? So it's not a wildness that is untainted by human contact, but it is also a wildness that exceeds human attempts to master it. It is not a wildness that is contained by the writ of the state, whether colonial or post-colonial, or by science. And that this wildness in many ways was messy. It was something that exceeded, reconfigured, unsettled the ways in which the category of the wild was framed within these colonial logics. So in this, I'm going to suggest that the other wild that was thrown up by the pig story illuminated the possibility of another world, a world of tentative and difficult fellowship between creatures who were often set at odds with one another, in this case, villagers and pigs, a world of relatedness and exchange, a world in which animals were not always and already imbricated in human projects, but came to these relationships as beings whose histories, though linked to humans, were not exhaustively contained by them. And so I'll talk you through that. But first, I want to try and tell you a little bit about the colonial history of conservation in this region and what conditions that is produced for these broader relationships between humans and animals. So I'm not going to dwell on this for very long. You know, you're a set of students who I'm sure have read this literature in great detail. But I want to begin in 1904, when the government of India solicited confidential comments from local governments on a draft it had prepared for a bill that would, quote unquote, preserve and protect fish and game across the country. So G. Bower, who was the magistrate and collector of Saharanpur district in the United Provinces, which is the region of which Uttarakhand was then part, dispatched a long response. He was, he said, overall in favor of increased protection for game, but was disturbed by several clauses of the draft bill. In particular, he found the government's suggestion that the money that could be obtained from the sale of hunting licenses to European and Indian sportsmen, that money could be used to provide guns gratis to cultivators who hold licenses for the protection of crops or for the destruction of dangerous animals, galling. And he said, look, colonial administrators already face a huge challenge in establishing control over cultivators who had ready access to state arms. And he said, or to cheap arms that they would use to kill animals. And he said, it's a very stupid idea to further empower these villagers to then kill these wild animals, which they would do through all manner of excuses. And he said, it's not enough that they actually face threats before they will make some of these threats up, was the gist of his response. And this response actually was really fascinating because it was echoed by many other officials. And the government of India eventually proposed a simpler bill, and they removed this clause, right, that would empower cultivators to shoot animals even within this larger ambit of protecting game. And I think that exchange about how you couldn't trust cultivators actually throws up some very interesting presumptions that continue to guide colonial or post-colonial conservation in India even today. So what stood out in that first draft of the bill were the conceptions of wildness and the wild that were in play at the time. Colonial officials believed that natives lacked self-control, quote unquote, and could not be easily controlled by the colonial state either. Their actions unfolded in an almost animal terrain where they were the wild, right? Wild animals had to be protected from the wildness of these natives. There are many people who have written extensively on this. Dr. Rangarajan is here, but also Keshav Ramakrishnan, MSS Pandian, Swati Shresh, who has a really wonderful long thesis on exactly this region, where she talks about how these debates actually revealed the ways in which wildness was a shifting category. It wasn't something that was always ascribed to animals, it was also ascribed to humans with a negative valence. More recently, with ethnographic work, there's Ambika Ayodhurai's really wonderful new book that looks at similar kinds of processes, Ninika Mathur, as well as Anu Jale, who has also a really beautiful book on the Sundarbans that looks at exactly these kinds of legacies of colonial conservation in this post-colonial moment. Also Shafqat Hussain, actually, who's a historian who has some really wonderful work on this. But this notion of wildness, I think, was really important because through these discourses, the native came to be positioned as someone who could not be trusted, right, to hunt within measure. And that is a particular kind of concern that continues to animate post-colonial conservation, as I said. So when I was working in Kumaon, if farmers found it really difficult to cultivate their field in the face of daily onslaughts by wild animals who were accustomed to living alongside humans, and many of whom and many of these villagers actually chose to abandon cultivation altogether. Even though these villagers could theoretically seek compensation from the state for damage to cultivation by wild animals, the process was really difficult and expensive. And what you're looking at is produce that was damaged by wild boar. To receive compensation, villagers had to file reports with both the forest and revenue departments, and then both departments had to conduct an inspection of the fields before approving the claim. Now, in theory, forest officials said, okay, we try and move it along faster, but most people I knew did not bother going if they had their fields eaten by wild boar, because they simply couldn't afford to take a bus to the forest department, wait there for the whole day, meet officials and file these claims. So they would just cut their losses and move on. Now, the forest department, while it was sympathetic to the plight of cultivators, it continued to deny the shooting licenses to villagers. So in 2011, and this is something I've heard repeatedly even over the years, I spoke with a senior official from the forest department about the wild boar explosion in the mountains. And he agreed in theory that it was important for cultivators to defend their crops, especially from wild boar, who he said everybody recognized were a quote unquote nuisance. But he pointed out that things were not that simple. Now, let's say I issue a farmer a license to shoot wild boar, he explained to me. What if he goes and shoots some other animal, like a deer or a leopard? I have no control over what he'll shoot at night. But the conservationist will then show up at my office and say that I didn't do enough to protect wild animals. So even if he's honest and shoots only wild boar, someone will complain to the media that the forest department is allowing the slaughter of wild animals. Wild boar are protected under the Wildlife Protection Act, so you have to be very careful. After some reflection, he added, now, often these villagers want to shoot wild boar because they like to eat them. The damage to crops might be in one place, but they'll shoot in another place. I can't allow that. I was struck by the subtle echo of colonial racialization in his explanation for the forest department's denial of licenses to cultivators. While he recognized the scale of the damage caused by wild animals to cultivation and the difficulties of living alongside them, he was skeptical about issuing licenses to villagers for reasons that were not very different from those of his predecessors. Villagers, he argued, were inclined to deceit and had little respect for the law. But his account of the difficulties involved in navigating the situation also raises another critical question, which is the power of wildlife conservationists and animal rights activists who are dedicated to ensuring the conservation of wild animals at all costs. And I should say here that wildlife conservation is an incredibly diverse field, and there are many, many conservationists who are very critical of these laws. But there is also, in many of these villages, the intense power of state conservation. And that is the form of conservation that they know most intimately. And so for them, some of these debates that are occurring within conservation circles are, if not meaningless, are distant, because that is not what they experience on a daily basis. So even as the state and prominent conservationists are increasingly warming to the inclusion of villagers in conservation initiatives, there is among many still a commitment to the idea that wild animals are inviolate and that they must be protected at all costs because of the issues involved in trying to think about when you might kill animals and when you might not. And I won't get into how this played out in Uttarakhand specifically. I'm happy to talk about that later. But I'll say that for most villagers, what was frustrating about this fetishization of wilderness as autonomous and inviolate was the fact that it ignored how their lives had come to be related to those of wild boar, not because of any conscious attempt on their part, but as the outcome of a complicated colonial and post-colonial history. Having been figured for so long as a threat to the continued existence of wild animals, villagers found themselves unable to break with the violent forms of connection that had been thrust on them by this history of conservation. For better or worse, they argued, conservation laws bound their futures to those of wild animals. As long as they couldn't shoot wild boar who were eating their crops, they couldn't farm and they would have to migrate. There was a very simple way in which people talked about how the presence of wild animals made it difficult for them to actually continue with their lives. In particular, I think what was really revealing was how much this anger was also linked to an anger against the state, because the unbridled plunder that was committed by wild boar was linked to the whims of colonial and post-colonial states that valued, for many people, their animal subjects more than their human subjects. And this was a refrain I heard constantly, right? That the state cares more about wild animals than they care about us. And this particular cycle has played out in multiple occasions. So in 2016, there were talks about allowing conservation licenses to shoot wild boar, and there was a huge furor. Menaka Gandhi, People for Animals, several other conservation groups also got involved and kind of pushed the forest department. And eventually there were no licenses issued, particularly in the region where I work. And people just said, well, look, there's no point. We're kind of doomed. And there was the thing that they kept going back to was that story of the pig who went wild. And they said, where does such a precarious history of wilding, where does this kind of fluid and contingent understanding of wildness fit within the narratives of the state? And for them, there was what the story of the wild pig illuminated was that there was no pure nature that was not always and already mediated by history and politics. They argued that the particular history of the sow who went wild, and this wasn't just, oh, all wildness is fluid and contingent. It was very much about the individual history of this boar. And that brings me back to my point about multi-species ethnography. I think there is something to be gained from being attentive to these individual histories because they illuminate how people respond to these larger kinds of projects. For them, that individual history demanded that conservationists be open to the errant and unpredictable nature of animals who could not be contained within the ambit of human intentionality. They argued that pigs had a particular tendency to go wild, right? That there was something about the nature of pigs that had to be understood before they could be declared as wild. And that's what I want to get into. I want to think about how pigs go wild and why that narrative was so meaningful in that region. So let me move quickly into pigs and weediness and wildness. So wild boar, I won't tell you much about wild boar, but I just want to point out that there was some the breeding, the kind of the ways in which wild boar bred were brought up multiple times by people and their belligerent natures were something that people often invoke to explain why they were more afraid of wild boar than even leopards in Uttarakhand. This was something I heard all the time. If you come across a leopard, chances are that it'll run away, people would tell me, unless it's a man-eater. But if you have the misfortune to run into wild boar, then you should immediately climb a tree or they'll tear you down. When I finally encountered a group of wild boar a few weeks into my fieldwork, I was on my own. I was standing in a terraced field up the mountain from them. And what initially got my attention was the sound of grunts, which sounded louder than they were in the midday silence. When I looked around for the source of the sounds, I spotted several dark gray bodies standing in the middle of a dark brown patch that stood out in this otherwise shockingly green landscape. They had rooted up and consumed the crops on the narrow field on which they were standing, with only a small patch of pea plants remaining for them to eat their way through. When they looked up a few moments later and saw me standing on the horizon, one of the boars stopped eating the delicate white pea flowers that she had been savoring until then. She grunted and held her body taut, the muscles in her back stiff with anticipation. The other boar looked at her every now and then, but continued eating. After a few moments, when I shifted my weight, the boar grunted again and charged a few steps forward, butting against the wall of the terraced field. I was unsure of my ability to outrun them in case they did charge me in earnest, and so I turned tail and ran to the safety of the nearest house. The problem, Leela, this neighbor whose house I'd run to, said as I recounted the story of my escape, is that these pigs are just like domestic pigs. They keep hanging around here. Tendrils of smoke curled around her face as she bent to blow vigorously on the fire that was smoldering reluctantly in the mud stove, the logs of oak and pine having been drenched by the day's rain. If these pigs are wild, then they should just live in the forest, eat wild plants. But they want the best food, wheat, potatoes, peas. If an outsider saw this, they would say we're raising them. This is the potato field, by the way, that was dug up by wild boar. Her husband, Mohan, who was sitting in the front room of the house and was watching television while listening to our conversation, perked up at this. Yes, that's absolutely right, he said. The forest department has dumped the responsibility for these pigs on us. Now, what should we call them? Domestic pigs? Wild pigs? Who knows? After a moment, he had an epiphany and walked back into the kitchen. You should think of them, he said, as Paltu-Jungli, domestic wild. There's something wild in them, that much we admit. But all pigs have that compulsion in them, that much I can tell you. Have you ever heard about the sow who ran away from the IVRI? When I said I had heard the story, he smiled. Yay, he said, bringing his hand down in the air delightedly, knowing that I had understood his point. Look at that. She wanted wildness, Junglipana, and she ran away. All these pigs have that compulsion. But even if they're wild, they can't stay without us. They must have this relationship with us. Look at these wild pigs outside. That's why I'm saying that Paltu-Jungli. Mohan's wonderful term Paltu-Jungli, or the domestic wild, I think captures the fluid and contingent relationship between the wild and the domestic perfectly. In effect, he was arguing that all pigs are always and already subject to that affective tension between the wild and the domestic. Pigs who are wild consciously seek out humans. But even pigs who are in a domestic relationship with humans, and I like Stacey Alamo's term, she says that these are domestic, if not domesticated relationships. So they're not fully domesticated, but are domestic in some sense. These domestic relationships with humans, these pigs long to confine the escapes of that relationship and go wild. The story of the runaway pig in this region that circulated exemplified this compulsive yearning that pigs feel for the wild. For many people, the sow who was kept by the IVRI could no longer ignore the siren song of wildness. She wanted wildness and she ran away in search of it. For Mohan, wildness was understood then best, not as a stable state of being, not as something that attaches to beings throughout, but as a tendency, a desire that is latent in all porcine beings. Wildness thus takes shape as an excess of desire that, despite the best efforts of humans to control it, can sometimes spill over in ways that they do not anticipate or understand and cannot control. And this was exemplified to me, particularly in 2011, when I visited the town of Almora and met Prema, a young Valmiki woman who kept several pigs. Pigs, she said, were easier to care for than goats and cows. She would let them out of their pen, which is a rickety structure on the road right under her own home, in the morning. They would spend most of the day eating a mixture of grass, trash, and small rodents. In the heat of the day, they would lie on their sides in the cool ditch by the side of the road. When the sun finally lost some of its heat, they would come home, coated in mud, and then they would lie down outside their pen. But one pig, she complained, had been giving her a lot of trouble of late. She pointed the pig out to me from where we were sitting in her courtyard. He was lying on his side, and I could see that his bristles were coated in a dark gray sludge. Underneath the sludge, I glimpsed faint patches of pink. He was an impressively large creature. He's developed a terrible habit, Prerna grumbled as she picked small stones out of the grains of uncooked rice that she had in front of her. He disappears every couple of days, doesn't come back at night. I worry that a leopard will kill him, although he is so big that a leopard would be mad to try and attack him. I was intrigued by this pig's regular disappearance and asked where he would go. Someone told me that he has an adda, a lair in the forest. I don't know what he does there. He comes back after 3 or 4 days, but I'm afraid that one day he won't come back. Now, Prerna recognized that her pig chose to exist in a fluid state of what one might call domestication. She was unsure how long he would be content with only 2 or 3 days in the forest. She told me that she had beaten him with a stick when he came home after his first few disappearances. She had even tried locking him in the pen for a few days, but he was incorrigible and she finally gave up. She could not change his ways, she told me, but had attempted to establish a bond between them through other means. She offered him potatoes, one of his favorite foods, every time he returned from the forest. In fact, that evening, she had already kept aside a couple of boiled potatoes to offer him as a reward for his homecoming. Cows and goats are not like this, she observed. Whatever happens, they come home at night. But pigs are half wild. So all I can do is give him the potatoes. This way, at least a relationship stays in place. Prema's a boar shared a relationship with her that was domestic but not domesticated. He was half wild, she had said, and disinclined to give in to her efforts to discipline him. As I watched Prema make her offering to the boar, these offerings of potatoes, before prodding him to enter the pen with the other pigs, a request that he granted with the greatest of reluctance, I thought to myself that potatoes were a rather tenuous substance to base a domestic partnership on. Yet, on further reflection, perhaps they were as good a mediator as anything. Now, in noting this inexorable tendency towards wildness in pigs, both Prema and Mohan were attesting to the common wisdom, not to mention the observation of biologists, historians, and ethologists, that pigs are inclined to go feral. So in the United States of America, for instance, the population of feral hogs has just exploded in the past few decades. This is actually a huge problem in several states. And this is something that has happened over centuries. So much of this population of now feral hogs originated as domestic swine that were brought over by European colonists, and they went wild. And there's a really wonderful book called Creatures of Empire by Virginia DeJohn Anderson that talks about how this wilding happened. And it's not difficult to imagine a similar history of wilding for the runaway sow. Perhaps she gave birth to her piglets in the forest and she couldn't leave them to go back to the kraal. Or maybe she found life in the forest preferable to being penned up in the evenings and decided that she didn't want to go back to her captors. The guarantee of food and shelter may not have been as tantalizing as a promise of freedom in the forest. It is possible that she and her piglets bred with the wild boar that were already living in these forests or that moved into them from adjoining stretches of forest. The mixed oak forests in this region are rich with resources that could have easily sustained a domestic pig and her progeny. She might have munched on the acorns and other forest floor products that abound, or on the luxuriant fronds of grass that cover the slopes in the monsoon. She could have had her pick of insects and reptiles. It would not have taken long for her and her descendants to transform morphologically over the course of this process, especially if they were breeding with wild boar. Now, while this history may be difficult to confirm with our genetic tests, the story of the runaway sow resonates strongly with what we know about the tendencies of domestic pigs to go feral, and it bears strong resemblance to accounts of the wilding of domestic animals from other spatial and temporal contexts. For villagers, there was little doubt that this story was entirely true. Boar, they said, had a fondness for lingering in the village that could only be explained by their domestic origins. Several farmers complained that wild boar were no longer content with just raiding crops and returning to the forest, but now spent all day lounging in their fields. The adult pigs slept for hours in large troughs that they dug in the soil. Often they had piglets with them, which made approaching the area a dangerous proposition. The humans who had to learn how to share space with these pigs devised ingenious strategies to navigate this difficult co-presence. So Dinesh, an 18-year-old boy who had a reputation for being very fond of the girls, once told me and a group of others that he had a foolproof plan for making it past a group of wild boar without injury. "Have you heard Main Tera Boyfriend Tu Meri Girlfriend?" he asked me. Everybody nodded. The song was a rage amongst everybody in the summer of 2015. Strains of the catchy na 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 could be heard all over people's phones. And then Dinesh told me that he was once walking up the main road and listening to the song, and suddenly he heard these noises. He started to grunt vigorously to tell us what the noises were. And he said, "I thought one of my friends was playing a prank on me, but then I saw some wild boar running away. Maybe they don't like the song," he said, "like my cha-cha. Now I don't walk anywhere without playing the song," he laughed. "Let's just hope the pigs don't grow to like it. Otherwise they'll show up to dance, and I want a prettier girlfriend than the pigs," he said, with a straight face, while the rest of us collapsed in hysterical laughter. While he was sort of, making light of this co-presence, others were less kind of delighted by the prospect of having to live alongside these wild animals. People told me that they were worried that this had turned into a kind of this kind of safari park. And one woman told me that she had some tourists from Delhi visit and ask if she was keeping these pigs, raising these pigs. And she said, can you imagine? I'm going to have to put signs up now that says these animals are wild and let them feel like they're in a safari park. What was interesting also was that people would constantly base these assessments about the domesticity of pigs on their behavior. They kept pointing to what they like to eat, the fact that they loved potatoes and peas, as I said, that they didn't want to go back to the forest, that they had a fondness for some of the best kind of farm produce. And people talked constantly about how these animals were actually accustomed to and desiring of living alongside humans. And this is something that some biologists have called a kind of weediness, right? So the term weed species, which actually came out of primatology for weed macaques, is often used by others to also speak to how humans and non-humans kind of work together in these uneasy relationships. It's a term that I think a number of biologists have now discarded for its negative assumptions, but it's something that a lot of ethnographers have embraced with a great kind of joy, because weeds aren't bad, right? They actually speak to the discomfort of these co-presences. But for people, I think what was interesting was that this idea of the jungliness of pigs being something questioned signaled the instability of wildness and domesticity as categories and as states of being, and instability that for them emerged out of the tight interconnections that produce these multi-species worlds. For them, pigs led lives that were simultaneously entangled with and yet unrestrained by humans. Rather than making them taboo, as Mary Douglas has argued, the liminal position of pigs in this case freed them from the confines of a kind of colonial wildness. They moved in and out of multiple overlapping worlds. They refused to stay fully and purely wild. They existed in the state of Paltu-Jungliness. They sought immersion in human spaces, but they also claimed freedom from human expectations. The irrepressible tendency of pigs towards wildness for the people there was not to be then read as a failure of human control, but as an outcome of the vibrance and liveliness of pig flesh and mind. People kept saying pigs really have a mind of their own. They don't listen to anybody, right? They're these very kind of determined animals that do what they want. And I thought that Prema's lament, in particular, the woman whose pig would run off to the jungle every now and then, that the lament that she did not know what her pig did in the jungle, was to me a powerful reminder of the persistence and importance of difference, even in the most kind of intimate relationships. These interactions are lessons in how to live with difference without thinking that difference is such that it must remain outside the confines of human control. And this is where I think the lesson might lie for conservationists, that while there is a difference between humans and non-human animals, that difference is not something to be corralled and sealed off in the space of the wild. Perhaps there is something to be said for dwelling in the messiness of the Paltu-Jungli and for understanding what it means to try and build relationships for people across that kind of difference. The other wild then is perhaps sought in the space of unmasterable difference, in the humbling recognition that animal lives, even as they are co-constituted alongside human lives, exceed their imbrication in the latter. And I leave you with the image of Prema's potato, which was offered in the hope that there would be the possibility of some connection even across the difference. And I think there's some hope to be gained from that potato. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Radhika, for that brilliant story from the hills, right? I mean, we talk as sociologists and social scientists, we talk about the social construction of people's habits and values and institutions. But here are people are actually, they are kind of, they're talking about the state social construction of wilderness, right? I mean, and kind of bewildered, right? So brilliant talk. So we have some questions, and I'm going to read them out to you. Yeah,
sure.
That's fine.
Please. Thank you.
So Nishan Venugopal, he says, quote, I feel that if you can't think like an animal, then there is no option other than think through so human. Great point on critical anthropomorphism. If people need to get interested in wildlife, you need to bring them closer. then maybe you need to take help of human emotions a little bit. Now he asks, how do you think right now, is there a change in tolerance to this type of writing in scientific community? Because earlier it was even not allowed to name the non-human subjects, you study.
Yeah, that's a great question, Nishan. Thank you. I think that there's definitely an openness for many in scientific communities. I quoted Franz de Waal on anthropodenial, and he's somebody who's actually studied. He's a wildlife biologist, and I mean, there are so many people, primatologists in India, who have been thinking with exactly this point about kind of critical anthropomorphism for a while. So I think that there's definitely an openness to this within scientific communities. I think the challenge is, what do you do when it comes to policy, right? And especially when it comes to sort of changing state policy. And I think this is a frustration that many conservationists articulate, that there is a way in which the kind of weight of state law is such that you can't change it. And I'm not sure what we do with that, because I think the point also is that these stories are so different in different places. Siddharth was talking about the Nilgiris earlier. There are people who work in different parts of the country. And I think even in Uttarakhand, there are very different stories depending on where in Uttarakhand you are. And I think the challenge is really to kind of pay attention to that individuality and to try and create and craft policy, but also writing that is attentive to those differences and to that minutiae. Because I think that, everyone is open there to the idea that animals feel, that they have emotions, that they express rage, that they make fun of humans, that they act very much in ways that humans do. But how that's understood differs from place to place. And I think really that's the challenge. How do you both pay attention to that individual specificity while recognizing that state law in particular has a certain kind of generalizability? And for me, I think then the challenge is bringing those two or those multiple scales together and thinking through that.
Thanks, Radhika. Nupur, she says she has a very basic question, right? And she was wondering, what led you to look at fluidity in the Paltu or Jungli non-humans in the first place?
Thank you, Nupur. So I mentioned this at the start, but I came to this project actually from my earlier training as a historian, and I was interested in thinking about how wildlife conservation had actually emerged as such a significant project in this state. And I was looking at the creation of Corbett National Park, but even before that, at the emergence of a kind of conservation sensibility. And even in that writing, I was struck by how the wildness of wild animals kind of shifted over time, right? First from being something that was dangerous and something that had to be tamed. And I'm thinking through the perspective of the colonial state here, to then something that had to be celebrated as a holdout of something pure and natural in this kind of overwhelming cacophony of civilization. And again, these are very broad brushstrokes. I'd be happy to chat more about this if you're interested. But I was struck, I think, in these stories about how people kept insisting, how is this wild? This was something people kept repeating over and over again. They said, we feel like we're going mad, that we're told we can't kill these animals, and we know that they're descended from wild pigs. So in some way, I think I wasn't left with any option but to actually think about fluidity from the way in which people were telling the story and their outrage, in some sense, their disbelief, even beyond outrage. I think it was a disbelief. How is it that we're not allowed to actually kill these animals or to deal with them in some way, given that their histories are entangled with ours? So that really kind of brought me, I think, to this question of fluidity. And I found the term Paltu-Jungli so evocative, to be honest. There was when Mohan said that, I said, that's perfect. That captures it, right? Because they're both Jungli and they're also Paltu. They have these qualities that kind of shift depending on where they are, and that produces this kind of categorical confusion, if you will, where people don't know what they're dealing with, right? And they wonder, in a sense, how the state and how conservationists know with such certainty that they're dealing with wildness. So in a way, that fluidity becomes a way to interrogate certainty and to also bring into the frame all these histories.
Thanks, Radhika. So Iravati would like to know that the state of Uttarakhand had applied for, wild pig hunting permits to the center in 2017. If that was the correct year. Has that kind of changed? She wants to know with regard to interactions between people and boars.
So, I think this is also where we have to think through the differences between different parts of the state. So the state had applied in 2016. Even before that, even recently, there is a recognition that this is a problem. Every political party begins by talking about the wild boar and the wild animal problem more generally. I was just watching, I think, something that the Prime Minister did recently with farmers, and someone from Uttarakhand said you need to address the wild boar problem. So there is a recognition, and the state keeps trying to, to address the problem. But firstly, that's a problem that is recognized as such only in places where agriculture is actually kind of profitable, quote unquote, right? So it's something that's applied largely to the plains districts of Uttarakhand, or to certain other districts. But in the parts of Nainital district and then Almora district where I worked, this was really not something that was available to people as an option. And as I mentioned in the talk, I think there was a genuine kind of concern among forest officials about who they could give licenses to and what that would lead to, and the kinds of accusations that they themselves would be subject to then, right? Which by conservationists. There's also a major hue and cry by conservationists every time the state applies for these kinds of hunting licenses. So in 2016, Menaka Gandhi and another activist there had written to the center and said, this is outrageous. At this point, you might as well just say it's open season on animals and kill all of them. So the state was also kind of cautious, the kind of everyday bureaucratic state, if you will, right? So even while the political state, politicians were applying for these licenses, forest officials at the more local levels were really concerned about whether they could issue these licenses or not. And also, honestly, a lot of people said, why would we bother? Like, who's going to sit in the field at night and bother to kill these animals? And I think there's this kind of massive agricultural abandonment in that region, right? That has also been caused by some of these depredations. And people just don't have the energy to sit up in their fields and try and hunt wild boar. They would just rather give it up or just not plant at all. And it's created this kind of untenable situation.
Thanks, Radhika. Maybe we'll have time for one last question, and
Sure.
maybe later you also engage with us on Slack and take more questions there. But Hafsa Jamil, absolutely loved your talk. Now, in Sri Lanka, we have a lot of dialogue around invasive species that have sparked state intervention in terms of laws or ordinances and the budgets allocated for removal, etc. The question is, how do we improve research and policy about these relationships between the state and non-human species?
Thank you, Hafsa. Yeah, I think that one of the things that I find interesting here is that boar didn't fit the kind of category of invasive species, quote unquote, right? In the sense that they were not non-native. And people were arguing actually that there's a very kind of localized history that had produced wild boar in this region. So in some sense, they were kind of hyper-localized, if you will. And I think that, I think the challenge really is how do you work policy in a way that is also attentive, as I said, to individual context. And it's not easy. I mean, you can't have a state that says, okay, well, here's something for this district or here's something for these sets of villages. But I mean, in some ways, I think that is the challenge that lies before us. What is the scale at which policy is written? What scales do the law intervene in? How might that actually take into account these kinds of individual stories? Because these individual stories actually shape the ways in which people engage the law, right? So they don't think that, say, protecting leopards is unjust, even if these leopards are actually picking up children or attacking humans. I mean, there is anger, but there's not this sense that how dare you protect them. There is very much that sense around wild boar. And I think that we have to be also able to think about the difference between different species and so on. And I don't mean to suggest that this is new. I know that many conservationists are thinking about this. I know many scientists are thinking about this. But it is interesting that despite all this very kind of devoted research, the state law in some sense in these sites remains unchanging for people who are dealing with that. And I think that's the challenge. How do you actually work at more localized levels?
Yeah, sorry.
Siddharth, are you frozen? Sorry. Okay, yeah, now I can hear you.
No, we're like 10:58, but I think we have another 2 minutes. There's one very interesting last question, right? So Divya Ramesh, she likes to know that a core reason why science works well is because of structure of divisioning and classification, etc. Right? So yes, theoretically, maybe you can blur all the lines. It's very insightful. But while translating to on-ground action, she's not sure how excise are quite important. But a more important question is, how do we take the stories and make something out of it, right? In a way, it is a struggle even with ecological, bycatch data. She wants to know, what do we do with all this data? How to analyze it? Why? What purpose? And what end does it serve towards policy?
Yeah, that's a great question, Divya. And there are multiple ways in which I want to answer that. I think one of the things is, science works well, but does policy work well? And science and policy, I think, are different things there. So for me, this is also about thinking through state policy. And, not all science works well, not all social sciences work well, not all policy works well. So I think just that recognition that, maybe we need to think through some kind of middle space. Now, what do you do with this data? I think one of the, something I've been thinking of recently, and it's a difficult thing to say, but I wonder sometimes if different interests are not reconcilable. So what do you do if the project of conserving wild boar is not reconcilable with the project of protecting agrarian livelihoods? What would it mean to recognize that and to move with that? And this is a question that has actually been posed differently, and I think in a really kind of provocative way by, I'm just going to put the name in the chat here, by an anthropologist called Juno Salazar Pereñas, who works on orangutan conservation in Malaysia. She has this fabulous book called Decolonizing Extinction. And one of the questions she asks is, what would it mean for some people to be okay with death, with extinction? Like at this point, how do you let some species or some individuals die gracefully? We're witnessing mass death in so many ways, human death, non-human death. We're in this moment of kind of just of mass death, really. And one of the questions she asks is, instead of kind of being motivated by these logics of endangerment and thinking, okay, we can save it all, what if you say we can't save it all? And you recognize that you make certain choices and you learn how to grieve better and to mourn better and to recognize loss. And it's a really hard question to sit with. Even as I'm saying this, I'm sure there'll be outrage at this idea that we just let things die, right? Let beings die. But we do that all the time. And I think sometimes I don't know that we can actually bring all these things together. And I think the point of these stories sometimes is to sit with the mess they throw up and to say, okay, is there a way out? And I actually don't know what end the story serves in that very neat way. I hope that it can open up some ways to think through how individuals experience this violence and what they see as the problem. And I hope that it will influence certain kinds of, as I said, individuated, localized policy. I think that's what we need. I think we need hyper-localized policies that are not driven by mass logics of endangerment and extinction.
Thanks. That was a brilliant insight there. That's a great reading recommendation. Thanks again, Radhika. Thanks for the talk. Great start to the day. And I hope you can join us on Slack and maybe take more questions there. We also have another panel now on, conservation careers, right? And thanks again.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for engaging this. Thanks for these great questions. It's a joy to be here. Thank you.